We're here for the fifth installment of Friday the 40th. Everyone thought that it was going to die off after part four, because that was the final chapter. But we're proving them wrong with a new beginning, or as they called it while they were filming it, repetition.
I can't imagine why they would have called it that.
Look, I've watched this movie a handful of times. I even podcasted about it with Nick Allen like 5 years ago, I think, because it turns 35 this year, and I think we talked about it on the 30th anniversary. But oddly enough, and I wouldn't think this would be the case with a Friday the 13th movie, every time I watch it, I come away with a different experience of it. Now, it could be that in preparation for this show, I read the Crystal Lake Memories chapter on it. I watched the Crystal Lake documentary chapter on it, listened to the audio commentary, and then I watched the movie. So I feel like I'm immersed in the muck. But having all that information before I watched the movie again gave me a newfound appreciation for just what Danny Steinman did with this sequel. And even though it's much maligned, I kind of love it now.
I totally love it. And I saw it in the theater on the opening night. And I will never forget it. It was another midnight movie. So that was the thing to do, was to go see a Friday the 13th movie at midnight on the opening night. And I mean, I remember things about that screening, like, the audience talking back in certain ways and responding to character of Reggie the Reckless. And, when he says solid and them singing back, solid as a rock and, stuff like that. So I have a lot of fondness for this movie. And I guess sometimes I hear people say they think it's the worst or the second worst in the series. But to me, it's in my top three, because there's something about it I really, really dig. I can't put my finger on it. And it's really tied to nostalgia for the movie, like the other ones too, but this one I really love, and I would go out on a limb and say I love it more than I even like the fourth one, which we talked about last month, and which a lot of people feel is the best one.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to dig into here, without even necessarily going through the movie or the kills scene by scene. We've talked about this in sort of a meta context. There's so much here. People, I think, credit part 6, which we'll talk about next month, as being sort of this renaissance, not only because they bring the real Jason back, but also because it's got this sort of a, not camp, but, John McLaughlin had a real sense of humor about the movie, and it was a really good horror comedy, or a horror movie with comedic elements. There's so much fun going on in Steinman's film that preceded it that I hadn't caught until the most recent viewing. Like, it takes place at a halfway house for troubled teens, and there's all of this like anti-drug, focus on the family type propaganda and posters all over the place. I think one says, don't be part of the slaughter.
It's very funny. I mean, Ian, it's like a halfway house in the middle of the woods, pretty much, first of all, and a halfway house that has no distinguishable criteria for being a patient or a resident there. I mean, you might be somebody who has a stutter, or you might be somebody who's on the verge, who has anger issues, that's about to kill somebody with an axe. And that's all part of what this house does, so.
It is kind of like this prototype real world situation, not the TV show. I mean, because you've got Jake the Stutterer, you've got the nymphomaniac couple, you've got the guy with the anger issues, Vic, of course. You've got Joey, who is the first victim at the halfway house, who, from what I understand, was supposed to be mentally retarded, but he played it differently, because I guess they wanted to play him more almost like a Down syndrome type person or something, but he just came off as socially awkward. And that's the way the actor chose to do it, I think, because it would, in his mind, I think he was thinking it'd be less offensive or less caricaturish. I still don't know.
Let's try.
Yeah, well, Robin, the girl who got the machete through the bed at the end, I don't even know what her deal was.
You mean as a character, what her deal was? Her deal was to take off her shirt right before she gets killed.
No, I mean, well, there's that. But that's prerequisite for like 90% of the females in this movie. But no, I mean, just in terms of like, if we're talking about a halfway house that is, its residents have like one characteristic.
Oh, right. Yeah. Right.
Like, I don't know what her thing was. Maybe sort of like the Joker in that Joaquin Phoenix movie, just inappropriate laughter at the worst times, like when Jake says he's in love with her and she just can't
Yes.
stop laughing.
Yes, I know, right? But it's sort of true of everybody in the house. Now, if you look at um, certainly Debbie Sue Voorhees, who's often considered the hottest girl in the entire franchise, and ends up out in the woods with her boyfriend. I mean, the boyfriend seems to have no discernible a mental characteristic that would relegate him to being a resident of this house, and so that's probably more of them just seem like they're on a retreat than they're suffering from any issue, and certainly nobody's counsel for any issues in the movie.
Yeah, I feel like they maybe just didn't get time or didn't get around to the counseling, because there's a great breakfast scene after Joey has been hacked to death by Vic, and Vic is carted off by the police. At breakfast the next morning, Vi, whose characteristic is she loves, new wave music and always has her headphones in, and does a weird robotic dance. She sets too many places at the table, and she gets scolded for it. And she quickly apologizes and scoops everything up. But I was just thinking in that moment, what's that dynamic like? Could we have I would love for there to have been a scene the day before everyone got killed, just to see the whole family sitting down and trying to interact with each other.
You know what, like a group therapy scene or something, right?
Or even just all of them sitting together talking through their issues. I mean, like in Nightmare on Elm Street 3, which took place in a mental hospital for, troubled kids with dream issues, you at least got some therapy sessions to see how these different personalities really interacted with each other.
Yeah.
I know that's not the movie that we're watching, but I would have killed to have seen like a spin-off of that. Just take the killers out of it and just watch these particular people try and deal with each other.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the first one of the series where really there's not any attempt at all to make characters. None. I mean, now there may have been some attempts in the other movies, like in the fourth one. There's a little more of an attempt around Barbara Howard's character, if you remember, who's the one who's Peter Barton's girlfriend. She's reticent to have sex with him, and there's a little more. Now we're going to do a reach here, a little more sensitivity in that one, and there's probably more substance in the second one, and maybe the first one, because there aren't so many characters and they're given a little more time. And this one, I think they just said, look, we're going to kill somebody every 5 minutes. With 22 murders over the course of 92 minutes, that is quite a clip. And so we'll talk a little bit later about Danny Steinman and his approach to this whole thing. But I think they just decided they didn't want to waste any time at all on group therapy sessions.
Yeah, and I can see that. It's one of those things where I feel like you could have, if you were making a different kind of movie entirely, you could take this mix of characters and just have a lot of fun with them, even ghoulish fun, because wow. But yeah, let's talk about the opening of this movie. Yeah. This was one of the first Fridays that I saw when I kind of snuck it on late night cable, and it always freaked me out because you've got the Paramount logo and then it just jumps in with the Manfredini score. It's raining in the woods and Corey Feldman is stomping through the woods to Jason's grave. Yeah. And even watching it now, decades later, it really creeps me out because I know it's a dream sequence and everything, but the two drunk townies who are digging up Jason, they're all kind of dirty and skeevy. And once they open up that coffin and they see, it's almost like they have a realization, like they know what they've done. And they're like, oh, that's a real body there. And then, of course, they get killed. But Tommy Jarvis, when he sees Jason come up out of the grave and he's frozen in fear, and Jason just like picks up the machete and slowly walks toward him, it's creepy. I mean, it's like it's nightmares that I think we've all had where we're being pursued and we just can't get away, whether because there's a wall behind us or just because we're paralyzed in fear. It's a really effective opening. And even when we fast forward to, it's 5 years after the events of the final chapter, we meet a 17-year-old, 27-year-old Tommy Jarvis again. I don't know how this guy's supposed to be a teenager still. Yeah. I really like what John Shepherd did with this part, even though he says like 3 things in the entire movie. It's a really interesting exploration of the Tommy Jarvis character. And when people kind of write off this movie, I feel like they're not really giving an appreciation to what he did with that very little part.
Yeah, I mean, John Shepherd, Look, I mean, this is as close as a Friday the 13th movie gets to what you would call a character study, which is a mouthful in itself. And a lot of that is because John Shepherd, who was a UCLA drama student at the time, and when he signed on to the movie, he thought it was a different movie, thought it was called Repetition, and he only found out later what the real working title of the movie was. He approached the character as if this was somebody who was in a state of psychosis or someone who had been haunted for a number of years and also had obviously not quite right mental state as the movie sort of opens. And so everything he does in the movie, from the many times he's peering out the window or into the mirror or withdrawing into the corner of whatever scene is, you can see that John Shepherd is trying to give the character, as he's reading it, some additional substance that is probably not in the screenplay, and he does a pretty good job with it. And one of the things he manages to do, as Melanie Kinnaman said, that it's very easy to get to be bad in a movie like this because of all the things you might imagine in terms of probably the lack of directing of actors and the characters being paper thin in the first place, and the situation just lends itself to exploitation in a way. But John Shepherd manages to be pretty good because he really took the initiative for building a character that had a psychology as far as he was concerned, and it comes through in the movie.
Yeah, and I was always kind of on the train that you've got 4 and 6, or where you get the really meaty Tommy Jarvis, and 5 he did because he didn't really do much, but I think he's most interesting in part 5, and we'll talk about the difference between this and the next chapter next month, because it doesn't even seem like it's the same guy. I don't know what happened in the intervening years, or even what the length of time is between those movies, but not only did he turn into Tom Matthews and like this studly kind of action star looking guy, but he also has this kind of an assertiveness and a go get him kind of attitude. But speaking of gaps in the movie, I want to talk about this idea that we kind of explored beforehand, that the Jason of parts 1 through 4 was still not really zombie Jason. He was, even though he kept getting quote unquote killed at the end of each of one, it's plausible that he was just severely knocked out or temporarily stunned or hampered or something, and he just kind of wakes up and goes about his day. That parts 1, or well, I guess 2 through 4, just a really long, bloody week in that county. In part 5, he's still dead. And in part 6, he's reanimated, but it's just this weird idea that a half decade has passed since the events of the last one. It's still the same geographic area. The idea of like, what do people think of Jason Voorhees? That they kind of forgotten about him, because the people who run this halfway house, they don't really mention anything. It's only when the sheriff is having a conversation with the mayor that the sheriff jokingly says, "Oh, I think these murders are Jason Voorhees," and the mayor says he was cremated, which we find out later was not true. But is there some kind of a weird Jason Voorhees conspiracy theory and cover-up going on in local government? What's going on there?
I know. I mean, the movies, probably more than any other series, they just don't give a damn about their links to other movies in the series. So I think, we can explain all of this away by just simply saying that there's a new team every time, with the exception of Frank Mancuso and Harry Manfredini, behind the movies and the music and the producing. But we're dealing with original screenplays every time, original. They have no desire to link to anything except the lore of the fact that Jason Voorhees exists. And so they're basically reducing the movie to the what they believe the audience wants, and only one thing, which is to continue to put people on an assembly line to be killed. And so all the other stuff about the timelines and the character of Roy in this movie, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, in a few minutes, they just take it on faith that the audience doesn't care, because they're there for one thing only, which is those effects in horror sequences. And so it's funny that years later we're reevaluating all these movies looking for logic connections and the circuitous through lines through all of them, when in fact, even the directors of these movies later would, I never saw one of the other movies before I made this one. I went back and I looked at a couple of them. So there's really no attempt to create the lore of a franchise. I'm surprised it's held together as well as it has.
And that's the weird thing, because I agree these movies were made for one purpose, but I think when you're talking about a slasher franchise that's endured for 40 years, you get people who go back and watch them over and over again. And it's almost inevitable that since you've seen all of the surface stuff, a dozen times, that you're going to start picking up on things that are the next level down or even the next level down, even if there isn't necessarily a level that the filmmakers were conscious of. It's almost like it'd be great to see a fan film where someone picked up on the 5 years between the final chapter and A New Beginning, or actually the final chapter and Jason Lives, because there's like 5 or maybe even 10 years where no one was getting killed at Camp Crystal Lake. It used to be a death curse, and for a while there's just like you could go there and vacation and screw and do drugs with no repercussions.
Right. And like, what was Jason doing for a decade? Was he just recharging his batteries out in the shack? Was he? I mean, I don't know. Where was he? So we'll never know.
Yeah, I don't know. And something else that, along those same lines, and this is in the next movie, so I'm kind of cheating, but Tommy Jarvis, when he's driving out to the graveyard in that movie, says Jason belongs in hell, and I'm going to be sure that he gets there. Where does he think he's been this
whole time? I know. But yeah, so this movie sort of exists in its own world, more even than the other ones, simply because the controversy in the fandom around this movie and whether it belongs to the Friday the 13th canon or not, which is really interesting. I never thought about that until maybe the last couple of years when I did a little digging and saw that there are some fans of the franchise that really disavow this movie and just don't think it belongs in the mix with the rest of them.
I've had those conversations. I've read that stuff. I've agreed with it. I've disagreed with it. And now, particularly with listening to Danny Steinman talk about this on the audio commentary, and yeah, we definitely have to talk about him. But he talks about how the controversy about, is Jason really in this movie? No, he's not. He actually is. He's in the very beginning because he's in Tommy's imagination of what Jason looked like. If you look at the mask, it's got the gash in it. It's got the red detailing instead of the weird blue thing that, fake Jason is wearing. But then you've got this Roy, this imposter character who adopts the Jason persona. And what struck me this time is Friday the 13th, A New Beginning is sort of and I don't know if any series or movie did this before 1985, but it's like the prototype for the soft reboot. Because it's essentially just, the lore, so you don't have to get too much into it, but you've also got a parent grieving over their murdered son who decides to take it out on a whole bunch of, other, camp counselors or run troubled teens. And so it is. And at the very end, you've got the opening for a proper, I guess, sequel if you wanted to go on this route. Now, the movie did not, I guess it did all right, but the reaction to it, people just didn't really care for it. So it wasn't until I think a year later they started working on part 6 because they're like, well, most of these movies, they come out and they're green lighting and filming the next one within just a couple of months of release. Yeah. I think they wait a little bit between this and Jason Lives.
Yeah, I mean, this one, made $22 million, which is nothing to sneeze at in a way. I'm sure the budget was low. It was a little bit less than the budget on the final chapter, but still significant enough horror film budget, but it was profitable. And so this was, I think it became clear to Frank Mancuso Jr. that this would be the franchise that would never die as long as people were willing to go and see it. And it may be true that people were not as thrilled with the fact that Jason was an imposter in this movie. It's never really bothered me. I've never thought too much about it because certainly he looks, walks, and kills like the Jason that we know until the mask comes off at the end of the movie. So I'm not sure why there's a lot of controversy around this, with the exception of the fact that, it just is someone else pretending to be him. And furthermore, the whole concept of the movie, which is that this character of Roy, the paramedic, would see his son killed and then assume the identity of Jason is somewhat absurd. I mean, if you were going to go on a killing spree, I don't know why you would feel that you needed to dress up as Jason Voorhees and put on a nearly matching hockey mask in order to do all of that killing. You could just go out and do the killing anyway, right? So the whole conceit of the movie is somewhat ridiculous, but to me, it really holds up as a Friday the 13th movie, and it delivers, in my view, a lot more than most of the movies that came after it in terms of the and I'll say this as a compliment, sleaze and murder in the movie, I think it almost can't be matched in the series. It's a lot of fun to watch, and so I think there's many compensations in the movie for the fact that it isn't the real Jason.
Yeah, I mean, the whole Roy thing, I think it works, especially at the end. I love they've got the kind of the psycho homage where you've got the sheriff sitting down and just explaining what the hell we just watched.
Yeah.
Because I can imagine, and maybe you can speak to this in 1985, if you can cast your mind that far back to your mindset while watching this. There's a couple of
I live in 1985 every day. And
oh. So. Say hi to Doc for me. I hope that DeLorean's working well.
Yeah,
no,
right.
But so watching this, there's a couple of not red herrings, but there's a couple of cues, very blatant ones, that Roy the paramedic is the killer. You've got his close up of him looking right into the camera when he discovers his son has been killed. Yeah. You've got the sheriff making some kind of an offhand remark, and then Roy just pops up in the background. I was like, what? You were talking about me? Huh? No, I didn't do anything. But at the end, when he falls out of that barn loft onto the spikes, and then it cuts to the mask, and then it cuts over to Roy's face, really oddly kind of peaceful looking after he's been horribly killed. Yeah. Did it register that was Roy the ambulance driver? Because it's kind of a weird shot. It's very bright, and there's a lot like moonlight and rain on his face. Plus, you've got the prosthetic mask that's kind of peeled away. Yeah. Were you like, oh, that's Roy, or did you have to wait 5 minutes and be like, oh, that's who that was?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why the explanation is necessary. Number one, we're not expecting it to be anybody other than Jason, so why would we? Number two, the face doesn't look all that much like Roy, and so that it's from a distance at first, and then we go in for a close-up. But, there's rain and there's all kinds of elements on the face, and Roy hasn't really been a prominent enough character in the movie for us to get to know him in any meaningful way. I mean, this isn't Agatha Christie, where one of the main characters turns out to be the culprit at the end of it. I mean, this is a minor character who's had, 90 seconds of screen time prior to the big reveal at the end of the movie. So I think it's important that the sheriff explains that it was Roy and the whole bit at the end, because it isn't quite clear. It's not quite clear.
Yeah, and it's still an odd decision, because he pulls out Roy's wallet. He's like, yeah, we got this off of Roy. First of all, the wallet's completely dry. Second of all, it's got not only a picture of Joey, his dead son, but a picture of himself. I don't know if you carry around, outside of your driver's license, but just a little wallet-sized picture of yourself in your wallet.
Your wallet, yeah.
Plus, it's got the newspaper clippings that I swear were the same ones that were being carried around by the survivalist guy in part 4. I mean, it's just, and in those newspaper clippings about the legend of Jason Voorhees, there's actually a shot of Jason in the hockey mask, like a photograph, not like a survivor's rendering or something. It's a photo. When was that taken?
Yeah, right. It's one of those things that we're not supposed to wonder. We're just not supposed to wonder about this stuff. You know what? I mean, the entire thing, this is an absurd film. I mean, it's an absurd film from beginning to end, because it is simply nothing but exploitation, which is exactly what people like us love. So it's not a complaint that it's absurd, but even in the realm of Friday the 13th, it's absurd in that it's just a TNA show with killings every few minutes. And I say that as a compliment for this movie, and that's one of the things I liked about it, is that it's fast, it's fun. There's a lot of characters in it. It doesn't take itself seriously at all. Maybe John Shepherd does take himself seriously, but nobody else in the movie really does. And so I think the movie gets a little bit of a bum rap from people hung up on this Jason thing. And I think that like Joseph Zito, who was a more accomplished director on Friday the 13th, Part 4 in the final chapter, Danny Steinman has a real flourish about him sometimes, and he knows what works for an audience. And this is because this is a kind of master exploitation director, and a guy, and let's segue, maybe we'll talk about him a little bit, a guy who made a softcore porn film at the beginning of his career, Out in the Woods, and a guy who went on to make a movie a lot of us love called The Unseen with Barbara Bach, which is a fun horror film as well that preceded this one. And then Savage Streets with Linda Blair certainly is fun too. This is a guy who knows his way around what the audience wants in terms of pushing exploitation, which is what he does. And I think he turns that up to a maniacal degree in this movie with the number of murders. Now, it's also true, which we'll probably get to, that a lot of the content in the movie, the stronger stuff has been edited by the MPAA, that they didn't get away with everything they wanted in terms of piercings and murders and where the murder weapons landed and the gruesomeness of a lot of it. But you can't blame Danny Steinman for not trying all that stuff, because he did throw everything into this movie, including, of course, didn't write the screenplay, but there are many characters in this movie that just exist in the movie simply to be killed. And there's something fun about that. If you listen to the commentary, Danny Steinman has a lot of fun making tenuous links between the characters who seem very random in the movie and their potential relationship to the halfway house, what could have been really going on. And so I think he's aware of all this, and he really keeps the movie moving at a clip, and it's an attractive cast. And I think there's a lot of compensations for the fact that we don't have the real Jason in the movie.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't even talked about Ethel and Junior. I mean, that's those two characters, Carol Locatel and Ron Sloan. Yeah. They belong in this completely other film, but they're just sort of the crazy redneck neighbors of this halfway house, and they keep finding teenagers screwing in their farm.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh no, it's. Even though there's not a lot of character in this movie outside of Tommy Jarvis, there are plenty of characters. And even though they're quite often cartoonish, they're so random and weird. You look at Ethel's kitchen, it's just like dead chickens, and it almost looks like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. When she's making that stew at the end, right before she gets killed, I just noticed it's this giant vat of random vegetables and things. She's stirring it with her arms. It's not even like she's got a soup spoon or something. She's just in there. It's disgusting.
Carol Locatel, this is another person who was on the cusp of another career. She'd been in Sharky's Machine with Burt Reynolds, and she was also somebody who said in an interview, look, you always start out your acting career thinking you're going to do Ibsen and Shakespeare and all of this, and then this stuff comes along, and that's what it is. Now she takes the role of the backwoods redneck mother, totally takes the ball and runs with it, and it's a lot of fun to watch. I mean, that crazy accent that she's putting on, that wild wig, which she said Burt Reynolds gave to her on the set of Sharky's Machine, right? So, and just the entire fever pitch of playing in a very artificial way these redneck characters, her and Ron Sloan. It's a lot of fun to watch. We know they're in the movie just to be killed, but there's something very fun about that, and I think they did quite a nice job. I mean, in every one of the movies, we seem to have these non sequitur characters. Of the later movies that. If you remember at the beginning of part 3, we had the Harold and his wife who own the roadside general store, who aren't unlike these characters in a way in this movie. We had the 2 in the morgue at the beginning of the final chapter. I mean, they're these kind of non sequitur characters that have nothing to do with the main thread of the story, but sometimes they can be very fun if the actors know what they're doing and just have a good time with it. I thought Carol Locatel did a great job in this role.
Yeah, and we do get a lot more towny action in this movie. There are the 2 characters, Pete and Vinnie, the kind of leatherhead kids, that I guess they were on their way to, that they had at least heard about Joey's murder at the halfway house because it comes up in their dialogue, but they have no other connection. They're just kind of passing through, and they run afoul of Roy. I think they were Roy's first victims, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. So he's just kind of testing out his murdering skills. You've also got Lana and Billy. Billy was the paramedic driver or attendee or something who kind of delivered Tommy. He was reading a porno mag in the front seat of the car. They set up all of these characters, but they're not all just at the halfway house, which is one of the things I think distinguishes this movie from the others. It's got a wider cast, of course, because you've got all these, additional kills, but they also tend to be adults. You've got a more mature cast of victims, one of which still breaks my heart, which is the grandpa, who, Reggie the Reckless's grandfather. Yeah. He gets killed off screen, but that classic Friday the 13th thing of throwing a body through the window, and it's him, and he's had his eyes gouged out.
Yes.
What is there seem to be 2 modes of murder in this, like 2 main ones: eye gouging, and then like maybe 3, meat cleavers to the face, throat slitting. Roy is not nearly as imaginative as Jason Voorhees and even his mom. I guess maybe that's something else that sets it apart, because even though I think the murders are brutal, and it's kind of cool that we don't see a whole lot of like gore effects that almost enhances the gruesomeness of them.
Hmm.
The lack of creativity in this in these deaths is really remarkable.
Yeah, and they're pretty quick, very quick. A lot of them are quick. And so Roy is not one to create suspense with his victims. He gets in, he gets the job done, and usually just in those very basic ways. I mean, there's a lot of impalings and stabbings and meat cleaverings in this movie, as you note. So I hadn't really thought about that Roy's style was a little bit different in the movie, but it is definitely the case. I think all those characters are terrific. Billy and Lana, for example, and then of course we have Vinnie and Pete, whose car breaks down on the side of the road. We have no connection at all, although as Danny Steinman said in the commentary, they were on their way there or something like that. So there's a whole bunch of people in there that we just get to know for a scene or two. And they're pretty good, and sometimes they're played by pretty good actors. When we look at the Billy and Lana character, I mean, Tom DeSimone, who directed Hell Night, I mean, that's his brother, Bob DeSimone, who's playing Billy. And Anthony Barilli, who plays Vinnie, who's one of the guys in the car, was a kind of a New York stage actor, was in a movie called Kiss Me Guido and a couple of other movies. And so these are some pretty good actors rounding out these single scene or single sequence scenes. And so yeah, I mean, I've always thought that stuff was fun, and I kind of admired the audacity of just sticking people in a movie to kill them unpretentiously. And yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, let me ask about Vinny and Pete specifically, because this is something, in addition to the whole Roy v. Jason thing that kind of comes up when people talk about this movie, is there's been kind of like an urban legend or an assertion that Vinny and Pete might be the first like gay characters to appear in Friday the 13th movie. And I was kind of like along with it because, stereotypically they're just two young, attractive guys and they're all dressed up in leather for some reason out in the middle of these woods. But watching the movie yesterday, one of their first lines of dialogue when they start to have car trouble is, pardon my language, these cunts aren't going to be waiting for us forever, which implies that they're going to meet a couple of girls that they want to score with. So I'm completely confused. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know, it was the 80s also. It was a totally different world. And so it's not out of the realm of possibility that they could have had dates or whatever. And who really knows? I mean, I think his name's Corey Parker, who plays Pete, who was a young actor at the time, who's in some other stuff too. And he brought his own wardrobe, and that whole leather hat and outfit was his. He just he loved that idea, and he wanted to, he wanted to do that in the movie. And Danny Steinman said, as he did with a lot of things in this movie, yeah, why not? Sure, whatever you want to do, do it. So that leather thing came from Corey Parker, and there's something funny about the chemistry between them. I always wondered that because there's a kind of cuteness to the two of them. Yeah, I mean, I see why people think that. They're alone and, dressed like that. And the way they interact and argue with each other is kind of like a couple arguing or bickering about something rather than like friends arguing about something. So I think it totally fits in. And why not, right?
Yeah. Well, the one thing I picked up on is we follow Corey Parker's character through the woods as he's going off to take a crap. And what really struck me is I think the camera follows down from his head to his feet, kind of like that horror movie thing of like you see one pair of feet and maybe expect to see another following him or something. But we've got the cap, the leather jacket, the jeans, and then Converse. I don't know how that works.
I know. I mean, what is all that? I mean, it's kind of like a sort of greaser look or something, but
then with cons, like I'm expecting, give me some Doc Martens, give me some, some boots.
I know, but I guess there's something about Converse. It's like retro 50s in a way too. Maybe they were going for like, I don't know what it is. He's going to look like Marlon Brando in The Wild One or something, or super tough,
Well, there's so much of that 50s kind of thing going on in this movie. Jake, the stutterer, he's got that, not a pompadour, but he's got the almost like a pre 90210 with the sideburns and the greased up hair. Billy's outfit has, I don't know what this is from, but it feels very much like a Kerouac kind of beat thing with the with the black and white striped shirt under the jacket, and he's snorting cocaine. It's more like a Hunter Thompson beat era thing.
Yeah.
I don't know what was up with this this aesthetic, but I guess if people just kind of brought their own thing to the movie, and Steinman was like, I don't care, just as long as the girls show their tits,
Yeah.
it very much comes across, and that's I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I mean, let's segue to that because I want to say, like, the commentary on the Friday the 13th Part 5 disc is one of the all-time most fun commentaries that you might run across and want to listen to, because all of them in the commentary, and they're very kind of different people. I mean, Danny Steinman is there, Shavar Ross is there, of course, who plays Reggie the Reckless, and then John, of course, who's playing Tommy. I mean, they're very different people in life. And Danny Steinman is a hoot. And anybody who digs into the kind of lore of the making of this movie, and people have varying perceptions of Danny Steinman, what drove him, what he was focused on or not focused on in the movie. And, everybody's got a strong feeling about Danny Steinman's contributions to this movie as a director, right from the casting of the women and things that they went through, some of them when they were being cast, through the traditional stuff, the directing stuff, and his style of directing as well. But even when we listened to him in this commentary, which I think was recorded in 2008 or 9, and I think he passed away in 2012, this is one freewheeling, wild, I mean, what's the word to describe it, Ian? You and I are probably both thinking the same thing right now. This is a guy very comfortable in the realm of exploitation and not afraid to have lots of laughs around that. And you can see why this type of personality made the movies that he made, particularly this one. And it sounds wrong in the moment of the Me Too movement and so forth, but to listen to Danny Steinman talk about the women in the movie and
It's yeah. I mean,
some of the things I was hearing, and not just the women, but also some of the outrageous stuff about the character of Reggie the Reckless, who was a young kid at the time, and we can go into that stuff depending upon how open we want to be about it.
Let's do it. It's funny because. And this part isn't funny, but it's very interesting when you're talking about the dynamic of Shepard, Ross, and Steinman. And they had Michael Felsher on the phone, who was, I guess, supposed to be moderating, but I think it's because he was on the phone, and also those three big personalities were in the room. He was just kind of like chimed in every once in a while. But John Shepard and Shavar Ross are Christians, and they make no bones about it. Not that they need to, but I love Shavar Ross constantly talking about Reggie's jumpsuit, saying that he was bathed in the blood of Jesus, and that's why he survived Roy's attacks. But talking about that very strange dynamic. And John Shepard, I think it was in Crystal Lake Memories, talked a bit more about wrestling with the idea of being a Christian, being an actor, and also starring in this movie. Like, he would have to go to church after this thing opened and explain to the mothers why he was in this filth. But then a friend of his essentially saying, well, this is your chance to be the good guy and to show a good example amidst all of this, these fallen people, which I think was interesting. But then Steinman he's a lovable kind of a character. He's very funny, but the sleaze just oozes off of him. And I can only imagine what it must have been like to actually be on set. I mean, one of the big stories that came out of this was the Debbie Sue Voorhees scene in the woods, where she's having sex, and Steinman is apparently off screen with, I can't remember the name of the actor who was with her, who was on top of her doing his thing, but Steinman's off to the side saying, fuck her, like he's directing a porno movie, and everyone is just like, what's going on here, everybody?
It's pretty funny. And then Debbie Sue Voorhees, of course, said, well, look, I mean, he was great with me in that scene. He was so sensitive and so concerned about me and my feelings and how I felt. So obviously he had a kind of a light touch with her, but you really can hear his true feelings in the commentary when that scene comes up and she's lying there completely naked, and he's saying things like, my God, what a woman. It's great.
What's interesting about that is that Darcy DeMoss, who was in part 6, was originally supposed to do that part. And apparently he had propositioned her like right as they were about to start shooting, and she turned him down. I think he had brought her into audition, and he's like, yeah, you're great. Now I need you to take off your top. or show, bring out the goods essentially. And she's like, yeah, you're going to need to talk to my agent because no one told me that this was part of the deal. And I guess the next day she found out that she had been passed over for the part. Fun bit of trivia: the third contender for that role was Gina Gershon, which would have been very, very interesting to see.
Gina Gershon would have done anything, though. Knowing Gina Gershon, who's totally fearless and did it all for Paul Verhoeven just a few years later, of course, in Showgirls.
And I think it would have been, because there's not much to Debbie Sue Voorhees' character in this movie. She's basically the girl who likes to have sex. She giggles a lot. She says, hurry back, and that kind of thing. I think Gina Gershon, she might have shined in that role, but it would have just been like a footnote. Oh, yeah, she started out in Friday the 13th. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting about that woods scene is, even though there's a sex scene and then a horrific death, in between, it's like this really nice little bit of poetry. It's like Steinman, as much as he wanted to, I'm sure, get into her pants, really did appreciate her form, because when she's lying back after her boyfriend's gone to wash up in the stream, it's serene. You can hear the birds chirping. You get that feeling of just like lying down in the grass and looking up at the trees, and it is so serene. It doesn't belong in this movie. And then, of course, the killer jumps in and cuts off her eyeballs. But
But the scene is really interesting, and the commentary around it is very funny. Where Shira Ross is asking, so were they really totally naked? And he says, well, of course they were totally naked.
Yeah, on Pixar movies, at the very end, they have the credits and they have the Pixar babies because all the people who conceived during the making that. I wonder if there are any New Beginning babies.
I mean, I think it's safe to say that if Danny Steinman had stuck around a few more years, he probably would have fallen very far out of favor with the Me Too movement. I'm sure he would have been on the top of the list. But this was quite a guy who, and to be fair to Danny Steinman, I think he looked sensually at his entire cast. I mean, if you listen to him in the commentary, he continues to say that John Shepherd is great looking. What a great looking young actor. And there's one point where he says about Shavar Ross, he says, what a great looking black kid. And then about Melanie Kinnaman, he says, what a good looking woman. She's quite good in the part. And of course, in that wet top as well, later in the movie. So he really was attuned, I think, aesthetically to the look and feel of his cast. And he even said things like the boyfriend character's name is escaping me now, Debbie Sue Voorhees. This guy was good looking. I thought he was going to go on and be the next big thing and so forth. I mean, this is all sort of part of the, I think he's got a very sensualist eye for young actors, and he likes to show them, and he showed them in this movie every chance he could get. Even the character of Lana is the same as well. And so I would just encourage people to listen to that commentary because it's damned entertaining and politically incorrect in what I think is all the best ways.
And that's all the best ways. That's the best way to put it, because listening to the commentary, I was skeeved out, but mostly it was because, and this is a cliche, but he was saying things that, when the first time I saw this, I was really young. I was thinking about, thinking these things like, oh, he's really, buff and hot and she's amazing. Look at that body and all this other stuff. He's just, you can't say that nowadays. And not that you would necessarily want to, but it feels almost like a thought crime listening to a commentary from as, recent as, 10, 12 years ago. And you're like, wow, this sounds like it was recorded in the 50s.
I mean, the most taboo thing that he says that really shocked even me, I really, is when there's a scene with Shavar Ross later in the film where he's hugging, I think it's Juliette Cummins who's sitting on the sofa or something like that. And he makes a joke that says, well, she's afraid of him because he's too big for her. This is like a 10-year-old
I missed that.
Kid. This is like a 10-year-old kid. Then he goes back to it again with Tiffany Helm, and he says the same thing. It's near the end of the movie. I wrote it down because I just couldn't believe it. I want to quote him correctly. He says, Tiffany said, and this is about Shavar Ross, he was hot, but he was too big. She just couldn't handle it. This is a kid. This is a kid that he's talking about.
It's Dudley from Different Strokes, too.
Yes. I also got a kick out of Danny Steinman, not really knowing too much, a hell of a lot about his actors. So Haley, or Juliette Cummins, who was in the movie, who plays the kind of shy girl, of course, who does a non-character who's the girlfriend of the stutterer, right? I mean, no, we're not using their names as we should be. But he looked at her in the film during the commentary and he said, did she ever do anything else? And then someone said, no, she was in Psycho 3 because she had a pretty prominent role in Psycho 3 where she said, it's a much better studio experience for her and bigger production and so forth. And then later on in the commentary, I think he also says something like, so did she ever do anything else? And they don't say much at all about Melanie Kinnaman. Shavar Rossick, who's friends with Melanie, says, look at Melanie, how beautiful she is at the end of the movie. And I want to talk about Melanie Kinnaman a little bit in this movie because, as you know, I know her and I think she's quite something, and she's quite a generous person in life with her fans and legion of followers of Friday the 13th, and many of whom she's met and have access to her. And so she's quite an interesting person because, as she said, you don't want to be bad in a movie like this, especially if you're a trained young actor or actress, as she was, as John Shepherd was. And I think she's really good in the movie, and she's minimized in the film. So as final girls go, who typically in the franchise are in most of the movie, they evolve to become the main character. Melanie Kinnaman is off screen for a lot of the movie simply as a byproduct of the fact that there are so many kills in the movie, as we talked about, that the movie's constantly departing to kill these two or these two new characters or these two. So we don't, unfortunately, in the movie get enough of a real picture of Pam Roberts, her character. And it's too bad because I think Melanie Kinnaman is really up to the task. I think she's the best looking woman in the entire Friday the 13th franchise, in my view. And I think she's really good in their requisite final chase and so forth. I mean, there is some fun to be had in the falling down in the mud and crawling through the mud and her inability to get up. And at one point she actually did fall down, as we see in the film. And Danny Steinman yelled at her, just keep rolling around, keep rolling around. And so there's some humor in seeing her rolling around when we full well know that she could very easily get up and stand up. But I think there's a real radiance about Melanie Kinnaman in this movie. And I think she's drop dead beautiful and very sweet. And she should have had a better part, or a more substantial part, as final girls go.
I agree. I mean, it's interesting because I hadn't really considered her much in terms of the final girl canon. I think you've helped me realize why. It's because this movie has the highest body count and they're constantly flitting back to other people to watch them get killed. So whereas you've got more of a focus on the final girl being the main character in some of these other movies, Melanie Kinnaman's Pam is, she's like the 16th lead in this film. Yeah. But aside from the reappearing, disappearing pink sweater, which is another fun thing, which once you notice in the final chase with Jason that her sweater keeps coming on and off, you just can't unsee it. But I think that last bit of conflict, that extended chase, and then the fight in the barn is really spectacular stuff. It's a kind of a joke that she falls down and she can't get up out of the mud, but watching it, I was thinking it feels very realistic to me, because if you look at what she's in, it's not just a big mud puddle. There's like leaves and, mud, and it's raining and this guy's coming at her. She's freaked out, but there's also nothing to give her traction. She's scrambling because she can't get her feet out from under her. And when Jason comes up with the machete, it almost is a callback. This is really artsy fartsy, so it's probably just a coincidence. Almost a callback to the opening scene with Tommy being paralyzed with fear and the knife coming, down. But then we also have Reggie the Reckless swooping in with the tractor, which this is 1985, the same year that Gremlins did that with the Futtermans. So I don't know if there's something in the air, but. Yeah. When she gets into the barn and she comes out against, Jason Roy with the chainsaw, it's really cool because she gets the upper hand and Reggie the Reckless is cheering her on. She slices into his arm and then the damn thing fails. And she's like, what do I do? I'm just going to throw it at him and make him feel loft. Even though she doesn't have as much of a memorable character as some of the other prominent final girls, she does have one of the most memorable end battles, which I think reveals something about the character that we would have gotten to see if the movie was interested in developing her more.
It's really too bad that the movie didn't spend a little time with her, because that role as the kind of leader or co-leader of this halfway house could have been right for opportunities for a little more drama in the series than have existed in most of the other movies, because just simply inherently through the fact that there could have been counseling going on, or alignment with some of the residents of the house, or support in some way. And she would have been very good in those scenes, because I think she projects a goodness and a trustworthiness about her, and just a likability that would have worked in scenes like that. And so I think she makes really the most out of a minimized role. And at the end of the film, when we see her in the hospital setting after she's been bedraggled by everything that she's been through, and she's got one shot in the movie where it's a tracking shot down a hospital corridor with the camera kind of fixed on her face from a slightly low angle. I mean, this is a knockout. It's a movie star look. It's a quintessential 80s look that she has in that moment as well, which I really love, the color of the hair and the eye makeup and so forth. But I think, movies are a visual medium, of course. And we've talked about Debbie Sue Voorhees laying on her back in the woods. I mean, Melanie Kinnaman's shot at the end of the movie where she's contemplating what she'll find on the other side of the door when she goes into Tommy's room and she's approaching that door. I mean, this is a great looking actress who has enough going on that she could have done much more in this movie.
Yeah, very much so. And this is getting back into the Friday the 13th lore. The last shot of the film, I mean, there's the fake out where she goes in, she sees Tommy, and there's a nurse there, and he kind of snaps out of it and stabs her, in the chest. But then we get the real ending, which is a nice play because they use the same establishing beat of her walking down the hallway and opening the door. It's a very different situation. Yeah. But do you think he actually killed her? Was that a fantasy sequence? Because she gets lumped in, for me, with the rest of the final girls in the Friday the 13th movies. Like, what happened to them? For that matter, what happened to Tommy's older sister, who last time we saw her at the end of part 4 was in a hospital? Like, she was older at the time. I would have put her in her early 20s. Did she go insane? Was she not able to take care of this, young teenage boy? There's all these different backstories and things. Again, fan films are waiting to be made about this.
It's like they just don't do the work of connecting any of the dots. They don't care to do the work. And there's a cop out at the end of a lot of these movies. I mean, Amy Steele is the big cop out at the end of part 2, of course. And when we talk about the cop out at the end of this one, we just don't know, and they don't want to tell us, and they probably don't know either. And so I think it's just up for us to decide whether she was victim 22 or whether she wasn't. And so there's never any, there's no closure at all for that. So
one other thing I want to talk about, speaking about going into rooms, there's in the halfway house right before the big chase scene, when Reggie the Reckless goes upstairs and goes into the room, and into Tommy's room, which I get another great bit of red herringness, because throughout the whole film you're wondering who's doing all the killing. Is it Tommy? Has he flipped? Is that going to be the big reveal? But Roy Jason piles up all the bodies of his victims in Tommy's room. Reggie goes in, it's completely dark, and there's a flash of lightning, and that's when he sees all of the bodies piled up.
Yeah.
Side note to what I'm going to be getting at, if you'll notice Tiffany Helm, they cut, you see all the bodies, then they cut to close-ups of each of them. The blood on Tiffany Helm's face changes between shots, so look out for that next time.
I know that. We kind of do have to talk about Tiffany Helm, whose mother was in the business. She was a kid who grew up in LA, and she was one of the women on the set who refused to do any nudity. And so she does have an equally memorable moment. She made a memorable moment that people in the franchise love, and it's certainly her robotic dance movements, which really came from her, because the original scene was not that at all, as you know. I mean, the original scene was a repeat of a scene that was found acceptable in part 3, which was the scene where the character of Andy, played by Jeffrey Rogers, was walking on his hands in the hallway and then gets the machete between his legs, and that was supposed to be the fate of Tiffany Helm's character in this movie. She was doing aerobics. She was going to get sliced in the same way, and that was just, even for Friday the 13th and for Danny Steinman, I guess this was a bridge too far, which is hard to believe that it was. But that's how that morphed into the new wave punky moment that happens in the bedroom. That's just fun to watch,
It is, and it also gave us, that song. I don't know who did it, but not only is it a fun, weird 80s song, but it is also thematically appropriate to this movie. It goes, "There's a man with no life in his eyes,"
Very
you
good.
know? Yeah. So that could be a metaphor for Roy. It could be a metaphor for Jason. In this movie, during a couple of the fantasy sequences, it's not that we see Jason as we have in previous movies where he's got the one eye that's kind of lower so you don't see it, and the one eye that's, in the eyesight so you see that. These are completely blacked out, almost like fencing masks.
Yeah.
It's a very odd image. But one thing I wanted to say about going back to Pam going into the room after Reggie the Reckless, he's like, there's bodies in there. You don't want to go in there. She's like, stay here. I'm going to go. She walks into the completely dark room, and then it's almost like God turns on the lights. Like none of the lights in the house work, so he just flashes lightning again so she can see what he's seen.
And then we get the blood curdling scream. I mean, this is the room of bodies that's in, to some extent, in a lot of these movies, just bodies piled up somewhere. I mean, I remember in part 2 as well. I mean, maybe it's more blood in a bed or something like that. But there's always a room where something visceral has happened that's discovered, and that's certainly the case in that scene as well. We didn't mention, which we should. Miguel Nunez playing the character of Demon, who's kind of a very funny relief in the movie, and made up that song that he says people still sing to him to this day. I think Danny Steinman.
Baby. Yeah.
But Miguel Nunez made that song up, and then didn't they say that the actress playing his girlfriend was Kim Field's sister? Kim Field's from Facts of Life, his sister or something, her sister. But nonetheless, I mean, that's a kind of a fun departure again. That's there for no reason other than to give us 2 more characters to kill. And the outhouse scene it's pretty funny, actually.
But I will say, for as much as that's the case, sort of like the Devi Sue Voorhees bit, there's almost an unintentional bit of artistry, or dare I say actual filmmaking going on with the demon character, because Reggie and Pam and Tommy go to visit him at the trailer park. He's like the bad older brother kind of a thing that Grandpa doesn't approve of, but he's such a sweet guy and he loves his brother so much. He invites him into the band. Hey, you want a taco, burrito, egg roll, or enchiladas, whatever?
Yes.
And it's just a sweet, funny, really touching little scene. So that at the end, when Miguel Nunez goes into the outhouse and his girlfriend is like, they're singing to each other, and she gets her throat slit, and ultimately he gets rammed through with these spikes. It's sad because he's a really likable character that we just met like 5 minutes ago. I almost got the feeling like he could have been one of the people that was part of the survivor pack to take on Roy or something, not just, victim number 18. But also the way Miguel Nunez made Demon die with actual tears running down his face and this panic of being trapped, it's really kind of sweet. And we linger on it in a way that we don't necessarily linger on some of the other kills.
Well, of course, he gets trapped as well in the outhouse. I mean, this is sort of, and this is a reach, but when you think about the idea of being in Psycho, you're in a defenseless place. You're in the shower, like Janet Leigh was in the shower. I mean, this is your place where you have no protection whatsoever, and you can't escape. You're confined in that space, and if somebody should choose to do what Norman Bates did, then you're totally defenseless. Now it's sort of a similar thing in this movie where, and I'm not saying this movie's on the order of Psycho at all, but Miguel Nunez character is trapped and literally can't get out of the spot that he's in. It's a similar vulnerable position. So it's interesting. I wanted to mention one other thing Danny Steinman had said, and I think there was a lot of rampant drug use on the set. From read that there's a lot of substance abuse, and a lot of the young kids who were there in the movie were just there to party and have a good time, and they thought it was going to be a good time. And then there were the other ones on the other side who were a little more serious about the work, like John Shepard was as well. But there's a couple of moments in the movie where people are doing coke, right? And Billy and Lana are doing it. And Danny Steinman said, I think he was questioned by Shavar Ross in the commentary about the inclusion of the coke in the scene. And he said, it was the 80s. I mean, doing coke was like smoking a cigarette.
Well, I think it might have been the actor who played Billy, or it was on that commentary. I can't remember where I heard this, but someone had said during that scene, the coke in that moment was fake, but he said that was the only bit of fake coke on the entire set.
I'm sure it was. You gotta love Danny Steinman.
I do. Going back to something I brought up at the beginning, the sort of set decoration and these ironic signs that are all over the house and things. In that outhouse, there's all sorts of great graffiti. One of
Oh,
which is just a sign that says "Do not write on walls."
yes.
That's like the official post. But then you've got, I guess, there's some real Vonnegut fans in that production team because they've got Kilroy was here.
Yes, right. I mean, they've evolved. They're much more literate than the ones in the original Friday the 13th, who just wrote 40 yards to the outhouse or whatever it said on the.
By Willie Make It, yeah. God.
Oh boy, honestly. But you know what? Fun film.
Very much so, and I'm kind of glad that there was a bit of a backlash to make people rethink. Like, I don't like the idea of Tommy picking up Jason's mantle and becoming the killer. I'm glad they brought Jason back for the subsequent installments, but I also appreciate this being a little detour, almost like a Halloween 3 kind of situation where they're like, well, we've already got the proven box office because each movie makes more than the last. People are going to come in for the curiosity factor alone because we said it was already over. So we're probably going to make our money back opening weekend. Let's try something different, something new. Maybe it relaunches the franchise. Maybe it's like, just kidding, and then it's over at 5. But yeah, it's a daring sequel. It definitely is sleazy, but there's just as much weirdly artistry and touching stuff in this movie that it's not completely, valueless by any stretch.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, and sometimes bad movies can be well photographed, have attractive actors in them, and be paced at a clip that it's okay, that you don't notice how bad they might be. And maybe that's the case with this movie, but it's damned entertaining. And I would argue, and we'll get into some of the subsequent films in the series, that at least it's not boring like some of them can become. And this one had a real purveyor of sleaze behind it, and I say that as a compliment. And I always, when I watch this movie, I'm reminded of what Danny Steinman's focus was. Hey, and you know what? It'd be great to see those gore effects at some point that he lost when the MPAA cut them out. We hear a lot about Part 2's effects being lost forever, that we'll never see those because they were cleaned out of the vault at Paramount. But I wonder what happened to the effects in this one. I wonder if fans would change their tune on this movie a little bit if some of the more extreme gore were reinstated.
And that's the frustrating thing because I'm right there with you. I remember the box art, the VHS box art for Part 5 had the moment of Junior's decapitation. It showed Ron Sloan's face with kind of like that surprised look, but you could see the cleaver like in his neck.
Yes.
You don't see any point of contact. It's just edited so that, and I know they went back and forth. There was a controversy over the MPA saying you can only have one head roll where they had intended like 7 or 6 or something. So they just kept chopping it down and down and down. Whereas you look at something like Kevin Bacon's murder in Part 1 or the Bunk murder in Part 3 where the knife comes up through the chest, and you're talking about, Robin at the end of this movie, you see the machete go up through a mattress and you just see her getting her head yanked back. There's no penetration at all. So you just wonder where the standards are for these things. I mean, it's like we've seen this stuff 5 years ago. What are you protecting us from?
It's funny. I think it changes over time. You know what I mean? It changes over time as we become desensitized to this stuff, and what becomes, if you remember the creation of the PG-13 rating back in the 80s, because we wanted to be able to have the F word in a movie once or something, it became PG-13. We had NC-17 for a while, which now would seem the films that were NC-17 at the time, like Henry and June, if we looked at that now, that might seem tame by today's standards. So I think there's probably a kind of sliding scale over time of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, right? So it's interesting though. I mean, I know a lot of us would love to see those effects. I mean, that's the reason the movie exists, right? For the most part. So it'd be great to be able to see those, even if they're not reincorporated into the film.
Yeah, I'm right there with you again. But here's hoping. So for now, do you have any is that your final word on A New Beginning, or do you have any valedictories?
I just will maintain that I love this movie and I watch it all the time. I watch it every month, probably. I love this movie. I fall asleep to this movie along with a handful of other movies. And if I return to a movie in the series, it's always this one or the second one. I do watch the first one from time to time. I watched it, I think, last week, but I don't get as much pleasure out of it as I get out of the second one and the fifth one, which are my favorite in the series. One of them I think is a much higher quality movie in every way, which is, of course, number two. But there's a lot of fun in part five, and I just like I said, for the reasons, because it's sleazy, fast fun.
Awesome. Well, Lee Shoquist, ChicagoFilm.com. Thank you again for joining me on this. We're almost halfway there. It's hard to believe that we're almost at June, for crying out loud.
And we've already covered all the good ones. So
no, we've been pretty civil and on the same page leading up to this point. I have a feeling it's going to get kind of bloody in the next few months, because I will defend Jason X to the grave.
Okay, well, I sense some of your famous theories coming on here, so
I think I have to come up with some theories about Jason X. I don't know. They kind of come to me as we watch the movies, because it builds on each other.
For theories, I've heard all kind of theories that Tommy was possessed by Jason. It's like, I mean, there are so many theories about this movie out there. I'm surprised you didn't have a theory on this one.
Well, not so much theories as just positing, again, like we talked about, what was going on at Camp Crystal Lake in the years Jason was actually dead. But, there was that. I wouldn't say that Tommy was possessed by Jason. If anyone, it would be Roy, because, as we mentioned, he develops this obsession with Jason, and he somehow finds a mask that looks just like Jason Voorhees. You figure out how to move like him. Tommy, the worst you can say is that somehow he got, and this is why I think that end scene is just pure fantasy for our benefit. Why does he have Roy's Jason mask in the bedside drawer of the hospital? And also, where do you get that giant steak knife that he raises at the end?
Yeah, they're just letting him keep all of his possessions. It's fun stuff. I mean, we also should just quickly mention the actor playing Roy, Dick Wyand, who is really on the brunt of all this, obviously, because he wasn't the real Jason. He does come to conventions and so forth, and he's a good sport about it, but I know he always thought the movie was trash, like most people did. Of course, Dick Warlock is the stunt coordinator as well, and they're interchanging back and forth in the role. And was there a third person who played?
Yes, Tom Morga.
Tom Morga, that's right, Tom Morga. So Tom Morga, I mean, the tension between who was the stuntman playing Jason and who was the actor playing Jason, and Dick Wyand really wanted to play the whole thing and saying, look, I can do all of this. And his agent saying to him, you know what, don't worry about it. This thing is just a piece of trash anyway. You're going to go on to bigger and better things. And so I always find these stories funny of how people who are in the movie react to it later, perceive it later, and whether they enjoy it when they see it with an audience or whether they don't. And so a lot of that stuff is on record with the cast, but certainly a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely. And it is unfortunate when you, I think we've kind of talked about this too before, when you hear about people who are involved with these films, they kind of disown them, or at least until the convention money rolls in. But
even a couple decades, yeah.
Yeah, right. So yeah, I think that's a good place to leave it. So thank you for talking New Beginning, and next month we'll be talking about Jason Lives, Part 6.
Very good.
Which I think, that'll be the beginning, I think, of our points of contention, perhaps.
Yes, I think we've reached the apex, and now we're going to go on the downslope here.
Much like, hopefully, this whole coronavirus thing. Sorry, I wanted to get through an episode without mentioning it, but
there we go. There we go.
All right, man. Well, thanks again, and I'll catch you soon.
Sounds good.